Hello, dear story lovers. At the amount of 1,000 subscribers, I will post a huge series of special stories for you. Subscribe now. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of sand under a blazing sun. Jack Turner wiped the sweat from his brow, his khaki shirt clinging to his back. He'd spent weeks on this expedition, searching for ruins rumored to lie beneath the shifting sands. His team, skeptical from the start, had returned to the nearby base camp to restock supplies, leaving him alone with his metal detector and a stubborn sense of determination. Jack stopped to drink from his canteen, his eyes scanning the horizon for anything unusual. He squinted. Was it a trick of the heat, or was there a faint outline of something different, a small ridge interrupting the otherwise smooth terrain? Intrigued, he walked toward it, his boots crunching over the coarse sand. As he approached, the shape became clearer. It was a mound, barely noticeable, but its perfect curvature seemed unnatural. Years of fieldwork had trained his instincts, and his pulse quickened. "This isn't just another dune," he murmured to himself. Dropping to his knees, he began brushing away the sand with his hands. The grains were hot, like tiny embers, but Jack didn't care. Bit by bit, his efforts revealed what looked like a human form. Linen wrappings peeked out from the sand-worn but still intact, shimmering faintly as the sunlight hit them. He paused, a wave of disbelief washing over him. Mummies had been found all over the world, but not in this region of the Sahara. This wasn't the heart of Egypt, nor was it an area known for burial grounds. "What are you doing here?" Jack whispered, as though the figure might answer. Reaching for his pack, he grabbed his brush and trowel, tools that had become extensions of his hands over the years. With careful precision, he worked to uncover the rest of the figure. Minutes turned into hours as Jack unearthed the mummy's full form. It was small, no larger than a child, yet there was an unmistakable power to it. Its wrappings weren't yellowed with age like others he'd seen. They seemed preserved, almost alive, as if time had merely brushed past this one. What struck him most were the symbols etched into the linen. Strange glyphs none he recognized covered the bindings, their shapes glowing faintly under the sunlight. This isn't normal," Jack muttered, his voice trembling with equal parts awe and fear. A sudden gust of wind kicked up the sand around him, and Jack shielded his face, coughing as the grain stung his skin. When the wind died down, the air felt heavier, charged with something he couldn't explain. He looked back at the mummy, its glow now more pronounced, almost pulsing. Despite the unease curling in his stomach, Jack felt drawn to it. His hand, almost acting of its own accord, reached out. "I shouldn't be doing this," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to himself. His fingers brushed the mummy's linen wrappings, and the world shifted. It wasn't just a sensation, it was as if reality itself bent around him. The heat of the desert vanished, replaced by a cool, vibrating energy that surged through his body. The glyphs on the mummy lit up, shining brighter than the midday sun, and a low hum filled the air. Jack's vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt weightless. Then, as suddenly as it began, the energy subsided, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. He glanced at the mummy, which now lay silent and still, its glow fading as though it had used its last spark. What just happened?" Jack whispered, his heart racing. He scrambled backward, his rational mind struggling to process what his senses had just experienced. The desert around him was unchanged, yet Jack knew something monumental had occurred. He stared at the mummy, its form now eerily calm, as if it were merely waiting. Jack had found something incredible, something that defied explanation. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. Jack sat motionless, the scorching desert sun bearing down on him as he tried to steady his breathing. His fingers still tingled from the strange energy that had surged through him when he touched the mummy. Despite the silence of the surrounding dunes, he couldn't shake the feeling that something profound, something unnatural had just occurred. The mummy lay before him, its glow now gone. Yet, it no longer felt lifeless. The air around it had grown dense, charged with an invisible force that prickled Jack's skin. The glyphs on the wrappings, though dim, seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, their patterns writhing like living things. "Pull yourself together," Jack muttered to himself. He reached for his canteen and took a long sip of water, hoping the sensation was nothing more than dehydration and exhaustion. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't a heat-induced hallucination. This was real. As he reached for his radio to call his team, a low rumble echoed across the dunes. Jack froze, gripping the radio tightly. The sound grew louder, resonating deep in his chest like the roar of distant thunder. Sand began to shift around the mummy, spiraling upward in tiny eddies, though no wind stirred the air. And then it happened. The mummy's chest rose just slightly, but unmistakably. Jack's heart leapt into his throat. He scrambled back, his hands slipping in the loose sand as he tried to put distance between himself and the impossible sight before him. The mummy took another breath, its ribs expanding beneath the ancient linen wrappings. The faint glow of the glyphs returned, this time brighter, more deliberate. Jack could feel the vibration in the ground now, pulsing in rhythm with the glow. Before he could react, the mummy's eyes opened. They weren't hollow sockets, as he'd expected, but radiant orbs of golden light, impossibly bright and filled with an ancient intelligence. Jack felt their gaze pierce through him, as though the being were sifting through his thoughts, his memories, his very essence. "You awakened me," a voice said. It didn't come from the mummy's lips, which remained still, but from everywhere at once. The sound resonated inside Jack's skull, clear and commanding yet strangely calm. I didn't mean to," Jack stammered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The golden eyes flickered, their intensity softening. "You have no need for fear, seeker of truths," the voice said. "Your touch has freed me from the slumber of eternity. For this, you shall be rewarded." "Rewarded?" Jack repeated, his fear mingling with curiosity. He glanced around, half expecting the desert to erupt into chaos, but everything remained eerily still. The mummy slowly sat up, its movements fluid despite the ancient wrappings that encased its form. The glyphs covering its body now shone with a steady brilliance, casting long, shifting shadows across the sand. Jack couldn't tear his eyes away as the being raised one hand and pointed toward him. "You have unlocked the threads of the past," the voice continued. "Through you, they shall flow again." Before Jack could ask what that meant, the golden light from the mummy's eyes intensified, engulfing him completely. He cried out as a rush of images flooded his mind. He was no longer in the desert. He stood amidst towering stone structures, their walls covered in the same glyphs that adorned the mummy's wrappings. He saw priests chanting in an ancient tongue, their voices weaving a tapestry of sound that vibrated through the air. He felt the weight of a scepter in his hand, the cold touch of power running through his veins. The vision shifted. He was now in the midst of a battle, soldiers clad in bronze armor clashing with weapons that sparked with energy far beyond the capabilities of any ancient civilization he had studied. He felt the fear, the adrenaline, the heartbreak of lives lost. Another shift. He stood in a chamber filled with artifacts, objects of indescribable beauty and power, each pulsating with the same golden light that now surrounded him. He understood their purpose without explanation, their significance seared into his mind. And then, just as quickly as it began, the vision stopped. Jack collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His body felt heavier, as though he had just lived lifetimes in the span of moments. He looked up at the mummy, which now stood fully upright, towering over him. "You have seen but a fragment of what was," the voice said. "The knowledge of countless ages now rests within you. Use it wisely, seeker. The threads of time are fragile, and the fate of your world hangs by them." Jack struggled to form words, his mind reeling. Who are you? What are you?" The mummy tilted its head, the golden light of its eyes dimming slightly. "I am a keeper, a guardian of truths buried by the sands of time. And now, you are a part of this legacy." Before Jack could ask anything more, the light from the mummy faded entirely, and it collapsed back into stillness, its body once again lifeless. The air around Jack grew calm, the vibrations gone, leaving only the soft whisper of the desert wind. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the mummy's inert form. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, heavier than the desert sun. He had been given a gift or perhaps a burden. One thing was certain, his life would never be the same. Jack sat slumped against the dune, his body still trembling from the overwhelming experience of the mummy's awakening. The desert was eerily quiet now, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. He could feel the weight of something new within him, a presence, a knowledge, a connection to a past that was as alien as it was familiar. The first vision struck without warning. Jack was no longer sitting in the desert. He found himself standing in a vast hall, the air cool and heavy with the scent of ancient incense. Massive stone pillars lined the space, each engraved with intricate glyphs that glowed faintly in the dim light. The ceiling soared above him, its surface painted with constellations that shimmered and shifted, alive with movement. Priests in flowing robes walked in unison, chanting in a language Jack couldn't comprehend but somehow understood. He turned and saw a figure seated on a high throne, their face obscured by a golden mask shaped like a hawk. Power radiated from this being, an unmistakable authority that made Jack's knees weaken. The priests approached the throne, offering artifacts that pulsed with the same golden energy Jack had seen in the mummy's eyes. "You stand in the court of the eternal," a voice echoed in his mind, the same voice that had spoken through the mummy. This was the seat of power for a civilization that spanned stars, a people who wove the threads of time itself. Jack's breath caught as the vision shifted again. He was now aboard a massive vessel, its hull gleaming under the light of twin suns. Through a translucent window, he could see an endless void of stars stretching in every direction. The vessel moved with impossible speed, yet the ride was smooth, like gliding on silk. He stood among engineers and navigators, their hands moving deftly over glowing consoles. The room was alive with energy, literally. The consoles pulsed with golden light, responding to touch, thought, and intention. It wasn't just technology, it was something far beyond it. "We were travelers," the voice said, "weaving paths between worlds, threading the tapestry of existence itself. We were custodians of time, of knowledge, of the fragile balance that binds the universe." Jack's stomach lurched as the vision changed once more. He was in the midst of a war. The sky was a storm of fire and light, ships crashing to the ground in plumes of smoke. Soldiers, some human, others unrecognizable, fought with weapons that blurred the line between technology and magic. Explosions ripped through the air, sending debris and bodies flying. Jack could feel the fear, the chaos, the desperation of the battle as though it were his own. He looked down at his hands and saw that he held a strange weapon, its surface inscribed with glowing glyphs. He was part of this war, a soldier fighting for survival against an enemy whose face he couldn't see. "This was our downfall," the voice continued, now tinged with sorrow. "In our arrogance, we sought to master the threads, to shape them to our will. But the threads are not ours to control. We tore them apart, and in doing so, we unraveled our existence." The scene shifted again, slower this time. Jack now stood in a desolate wasteland. The once great cities were reduced to rubble, their glowing glyphs extinguished. The sky was dark, choked with ash and smoke. He could hear the faint cries of survivors, their voices hollow and broken. A figure emerged from the shadows, shrouded in a cloak of tattered linen that billowed in the toxic wind. Jack recognized the glow in their eyes. It was the same light he had seen in the mummy. This figure knelt in the dust, carving symbols into the ground with trembling hands. "We preserved what we could," the voice said. "Our knowledge, our history, locked away in the sands of time. We left guardians to protect it, waiting for those who would be worthy to receive it. And now, it is you, Seeker." The vision ended abruptly, and Jack was thrust back into the present. He gasped, his chest heaving as though he had run a marathon. The desert heat wrapped around him again, harsh and oppressive. He looked around, disoriented, before his eyes fell once more on the mummy. It lay still, lifeless as before, but Jack knew better now. It wasn't just a body, it was a key, a conduit for the wisdom of an ancient and forgotten people. His mind raced as he tried to process everything he had seen. A civilization that spanned the stars. A war that destroyed them. A legacy buried in the sands. And now, somehow, he was connected to it all. Jack felt a strange mix of emotions: awe, fear, responsibility. The knowledge coursing through him wasn't just facts and figures, it was alive, a living history that demanded to be remembered and protected. He couldn't explain how, but he knew this wasn't the end. The visions had given him more than a glimpse into the past, they had given him a purpose. The voice of the mummy echoed in his mind one final time, faint but clear. Guard the threads, Seeker. Do not let them fray again. Jack looked out at the vast expanse of sand, his jaw tightening with determination. Whatever this was, he would not walk away from it. The world might not be ready for the truth of what he had found, but Jack knew one thing for certain: he was now the keeper of something far greater than himself. This chapter dives into Jack's experience of the visions, immersing him and the reader into the rich, awe-inspiring history of the ancient civilization. The tension builds as Jack's role as a seeker and guardian is solidified. What do you think of the depth and progression here? The desert wind howled as the sun sank lower on the horizon, painting the dunes in hues of amber and crimson. Jack stood silently before the mummy, its linen-wrapped form lying still as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had changed. Jack felt it in his bones, his blood, and the deep recesses of his mind where the vision still lingered like a dream that refused to fade. For hours, he had wrestled with what to do next. The logical part of his mind screamed for him to document the find, to call his team, to let the world see what he had uncovered. This discovery could rewrite history or obliterate it entirely. But the knowledge coursing through him, the memories of the war, the collapse, and the warnings of the ancient civilization, whispered a more somber truth: some things were not meant to be known. Not yet. Jack knelt down, brushing his fingers lightly over the glyphs on the mummy's wrappings. They no longer glowed, but they still held a quiet power, like embers smoldering beneath ash. "Why me?" he muttered. The desert, ever silent, offered no reply. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, heavier than anything he had ever carried before. He wasn't just an archaeologist anymore. He was a guardian now, entrusted with protecting knowledge that could reshape the world or destroy it. As night fell, Jack prepared to bury the mummy again. He couldn't leave it exposed. He dug carefully, creating a shallow trench where the sand would keep the ancient figure hidden and safe. His hands worked methodically, but his mind raced with questions. Who were these people really? Why had they entrusted their secrets to someone like him? And perhaps most unsettling, was he truly prepared to bear this burden? When the mummy was safely covered, Jack stood and looked out across the darkened desert. The stars began to appear, pinpricks of light in the vast black expanse. He thought of the ancient ships he'd seen in his vision, the civilizations that had traversed the stars long before humanity's first steps. The enormity of it all was humbling. His discovery wasn't just about history, it was about the fragility of existence, the delicate threads that connected all life. He could feel those threads now, faint and trembling, as though they might snap at any moment. But he also felt something else: resolve. The next morning, Jack returned to his camp, his team oblivious to what had transpired. He kept the story simple. Found nothing significant, he told them. Let's pack up and head back. His assistant, a young graduate student named Lily, frowned. Nothing at all? You were out there for hours. Just more sand, Jack replied with a forced smile. Not every trip's a winner. The lie burned in his throat, but he knew it was necessary. The world wasn't ready for what he had found. Not yet. Back at the base, Jack carefully logged his notes as though the expedition had been a failure. To everyone else, it was just another entry in a long list of digs that yielded no groundbreaking results. But tucked away in his private journal, he wrote everything. The discovery. The visions. The warnings. Every detail he could remember. Someday, he wrote in the final line, the time will come when this knowledge must be shared. But not today. Years passed, and Jack's life moved on. He continued his work, leading expeditions across the globe, always searching, always learning. But no matter where he went, he carried the secret of the mummy with him. He began to notice patterns in his finding symbols, artifacts, and ruins that hinted at connections to the ancient civilization he had glimpsed. It was as though the world itself was whispering to him, guiding him toward something greater. Each discovery felt like another piece of a puzzle, one that only he could see. Yet, he remained silent. The knowledge wasn't his to reveal, not yet. He knew the risks. Humanity wasn't ready to understand the fragile threads of time or the consequences of pulling them too hard. Decades later, Jack sat in his study, his hair now gray, his hands withered by years of work. On his desk lay the journal he had kept since that fateful day in the desert, its pages filled with sketches of the glyphs, descriptions of the visions, and theories about the ancient civilization. The world had changed in those years, wars fought, technologies invented, societies reshaped, but Jack's secret remained buried, both in the sand and in his heart. As he flipped through the journal, he paused on the final page. There, in bold handwriting, he had scrawled the words spoken to him by the mummy. Guard the threads, seeker. Do not let them fray again. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the night sky. The stars twinkled above, just as they had on that night in the desert. He wondered if those ancient beings were still out there, watching, waiting, hoping that humanity would one day prove itself worthy. Jack smiled faintly. He had done his part. The threads were safe for now. And perhaps, when the time was right, someone else would take up the mantle. The light in his study flickered, casting shadows that danced across the room. Jack closed the journal and placed it on the shelf, its worn leather cover blending seamlessly with the others. He knew the time would come when someone, somewhere, would find the truth. Until then, he was content to be the guardian of secrets, the keeper of threads that bound the past, the present, and the future together. This chapter brings Jack's journey full circle, highlighting his transformation from an archaeologist into a silent guardian of something far greater. It reflects the weight of his responsibility and the patience required to protect such knowledge, tying the story together with a quiet yet profound resolution. What do you think?